Welcome to another Wine Geeks Zoom class. But this is a first for us because we are doing a whiskey Zoom class, and we are bringing in a celebrated guest to run the class. Heather Greene is a world-renowned whiskey expert, author, and master blender. She joined what was then Ben Milam as a blending and marketing consultant in 2018. And quickly transitioned to the role of CEO in 2019. She recently was selected as one of Imbibe magazine's 75 People to Watch in 2020. Before joining the company, Greene was the first woman to serve on the Scotch Malt Whisky Society tasting panel in Edinburgh. She also served as an award-winning Scotch whisky ambassador and is a current judge on prestigious tasting panels such as the American Craft Spirits Association and the ISCW in London. In 2019, she was inducted into Kentucky's esteemed Order of the Writ. Heather is the author of the New York Times shortlisted Whiskey Distilled, A Populist Guide to the Water of Life, and has written about whiskey for publications such as Eater and CNBC. She's also appeared nationally on media outlets such as CBS This Morning, Bloomberg News, Fox, the Food Network, and MSNBC. She is also an amazing singer-songwriter and a very dear friend of ours. I'd like to welcome Heather Greene.
Hey everyone, thanks for the intro. That was nice, especially the singer-songwriter at the end. Yes. Happy Whiskey Saturday, you guys. Thank you so much for joining on the beginning of what I hope is spring now for everybody across the United States. I hope you're feeling okay. If not, you will in about 15 minutes. So have no fear. Whiskey is here. But we are excited. So today we're going to talk about Milam Greene, which is the company for which I create whiskeys, and I'm the master blender and CEO. But that's not just it. I don't like to just teach you. We're going to use my brand and we'll take you through a tasting. But what I really like to do is kind of teach you about as much as I can, as much as you'll allow me to teach you about whiskey or just guide you about whiskey in general. So we'll start. Just some basics. I don't know where your comfort level with whiskey is, but I really do like to start with the basics. So what is whiskey? Well, whiskey is a global product, okay? So wherever grain was grown, some crafty person at some point in time probably made whiskey out of it. And they would have done that because they had leftover corn or leftover rye. They didn't want their crops to rot. It was difficult to transport. So making it into whiskey and putting it into barrels was a much easier thing to do. So we know that that's where it came from. Whiskey is a distilled spirit, and it's made with three primary ingredients: water, yeast, and grain. This trips people up because they say water, yeast, corn, or water, yeast, barley. Actually, that's not the case. It's grain. If you're making a distilled spirit, and you are using grain, not rice, but the rest of the grains, you can technically call it a whiskey. US, Canada, Scotland, Ireland and Japan are the largest producers. There are two spellings, whiskey versus whiskey. There is no, is basically just regions. Scotland is very historically without an E. All American whiskeys are with an E, but that is actually, it's not a law or anything. It's just kind of what we do culturally. Maker's Mark, for example, is spelled without an E. Sometimes it's just a marketing decision. In fact, some people think that Ireland did it just because they wanted to separate themselves from what the Scottish were doing. So to lay a foundation, whiskey making architecture is the same around the world. This does not change, but within this architecture, you're going to have a lot of variations. So the first thing we always have to do is prepare our grains. Grains, you can't just chuck them in and start making whiskey. You actually have to prep a grain. So the way we do that is we soak it in water. That's called mashing. We're prepping the grain to receive or to be eaten up essentially by yeast. And number three, a process called fermentation. For us, we use corn, rye, and some barley. We're going to heat that up. We're going to make it nice and soupy because we're trying to get the starches and we're trying to get the sugars out of that grain, right? Because you know, starches are sugars essentially, and the yeast love to chomp on that. once we ferment, so you guys are familiar with wine, so you know what fermentation is. I won't get into that. But again, fermentation tanks are going to vary and they're going to differ when we're talking whiskey. It goes into distillation. Now we're going to throw that fermented liquid into that still. We're going to heat that liquid. And our idea, the whole idea behind that is to get these really pretty aromatic molecules volatilizing up the still. Okay, so you're really trying to coax these pretty smelly molecules up off the liquid in the still. You're just creating steam or vapors, and then that little arm that you see dipping down, that's a pot still. It's called a line arm, Lyne. All of that's going to condense back again. It's going to get up. It's going to get cooler as it rises. It's going to condense down again, back into a liquid and come out as spirit, as a very high proof spirit. One of those molecules we really want to get out of that is ethanol. And so this is how we make our high proof spirit, because we're extracting ethanol and we're leaving water behind. So we're going to grab all the ethanol and all these pretty flavors, but we're going to leave water behind. And then finally, aging. Once we are doing aging, this is where a lot of the interesting stuff can happen in how we age our whiskeys. It's how and what determines on the label of the bottle you buy. And then, of course, bottling. And bottling, those labels will reflect everything that happened beforehand in this process. So whiskey is an umbrella term. In Scotland is Scotch. In Ireland, it's Irish whiskey. And as I said, those big producing regions like Japan is Japanese whiskey. And in America, we actually have the two most popular kinds are bourbon and rye. Bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States. Our bourbon happens to be made in a couple of different places, which is very unusual for a craft whiskey. So our distillery is located, the headquarters and distillery is in Hill Country, Texas. And it is surprisingly to me, because I moved here a couple years ago, very lush, very green, quite verdant. And if you guys remember what happened a couple months ago in Texas, like it got cold, and it does get cold here. And then we go very quickly into triple digit temperatures, above 100 degrees, and it can last for a couple of months, so on and off. So it's a very, very difficult terroir to work with. We distill here in Blanco, and we also, master distiller Marlene Holmes actually comes from Kentucky. And when she joined the company, we were like, well, let's continue making our whiskey in Kentucky. So that's being aged right now. So we are making whiskey in Blanco, Texas and Kentucky. We have sourced whiskey. So I go out and I find barrels. This is something that I really love doing in Scotland. This is when I was a judge on the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society tasting panel. I would taste casks that the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society would bring in, and we decide whether it was good enough for international distribution. So they call it independent bottling there, and it's actually quite difficult to do. It's an art form. I'd like to think of it as an art form. So we bring whiskeys in from Tennessee, already aged as well. We have rye coming in from Indiana, and then we finish those in port cask from Portugal. So really the idea of Milam Greene is, it's the philosophy for us of bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States, rye can be made anywhere in the United States, and we do that. We have rye and bourbons being made in different places, including our own. Now, if you remember that wily terroir I was telling you about in Texas with that massive, crazy, above 100-degree temperatures, this creates havoc in a warehouse. Like these whiskeys, a lot of these craft whiskeys, not only in Texas, but in parts of California and even colder climates where you don't really know what's going on, they didn't really yield great whiskeys for a long time because they were learning on the job. It was a lot of experimentation. So we know that by making sure we have spirit coming in from Kentucky, spirit coming in from Tennessee, our own spirit, and then we do stuff to them in Texas, we can create what happens is when you see a bottle of Milam and Greene, you know that what's in that is going to be something really good because we're embracing the totality of what you can do to produce whiskey. Now, as I said, whiskey is an umbrella term. So in order to be called a bourbon, it's got to be made in the United States. It has to be aged in new charred oak. We've got to fill it at a certain ABV. We have to bottle it no less than 40% ABV or proof, 80 proof, and all of that stuff. So there's a lot of rules and parameters under which we have to call ourselves a bourbon and a rye in America, just like Scotland has. If you're going to be call yourself a single malt Scotch, it's one single distillery made with barley. So everybody has their rules and their variations in how they have to make their whiskey. Distillation, speaking of which, so the other reason why we like to distill in Kentucky and also in Blanco is, do you see that still on the left-hand side? That's a copper pot still. So remember I was talking to you about distillation. That's tiny. That is 300 gallons. That can make us 100 barrels a year, a very small amount of barrels that we can actually make out of that. So, but it creates a really rich, wonderful, spicy character. So we're actually going to expand that because we need more. We, on the right-hand side in Kentucky, we're using column stills. This is a different style of still. You don't see these marketed that much because they're not as pretty. They're these giant column stills. They're a continuous system. They produce massive amounts of product and they're very clean tasting. So when they come off the still, they're very pretty, very pure. You can really finesse the flavors. On the left-hand side as a pot still, it's much harder to do that. It's just a batch distillation. It's like what, you boil it and you get it. Over on the right, it's a much easier thing to do. So it's really nice for us to have distilleries that we work with that do column, and we do the batch copper pot in our distillery. And together, once we age these, we actually end up getting a really nice product. And then also you can bottle very specifically different stills. And this really excites me. And this is not happening in craft whiskey, is the use of different stills, the use of different states, the use of different barrels. But it's not unusual in the world of whiskey. In fact, the Japanese do this really, really well. Once we distill, this is where all the decisions, the big decisions, I kind of touched on that a second ago, but this is Marlene, our master distiller from Kentucky. She was at Jim Beam for 27 years, and now she's going on 3 years. She started with me scaling this company. She cannot make a bad whiskey. It's really incredible. She's really, really amazing. So what we're doing, I have something called a thief in my right hand. It's like a giant straw. You dip it in the cask, you block it. So you hold the liquid and then the other person has their whiskey and you give a sample. And this is where we make evaluation like, okay, do we want to blend this with or batch this with another whiskey? Do we think it needs more time? Is there something unusual about this that it should just be on its own? Like we just take the liquid from that, which will yield maybe 280 bottles, and then chuck that barrel away. And then, because that's by law, we have to do that if it's bourbon, because we can only use our barrel one time. That's one of the legalities. That is a single barrel, for example. We're going to taste those together. Is there anything wrong with it? Because that's happened too. There's been time, and this is what's so great about having a distiller like Marlene, is she can say, even after 3 months, she'll say like, something's wrong with this. And we've got to go all the way back into our process, that architecture I told you, and try to figure out what happened. And for a long time, craft distillers, they didn't have this knowledge. They're starting to have it now, but having somebody from Kentucky on our team is just priceless because they can identify that before it actually, finishes aging, or maybe we have like a bunch of barrels we can't use because it turns out like there was a leak in the pipe or the pH balance was off. There's all these things that can happen. Char levels, people have a lot of questions about this. We do char the barrels before we put whiskey in it to get those beautiful wood sugars out of the wood. We opening up the little, I like to call them nooks and crannies in the wood to get that ethanol in and bring out all those pretty flavors. All the way in Kentucky, you usually see a char 4. So it's 55 seconds, it's deeper. In Texas, what we found is that's not necessary. We don't want the heat, and the dryness can accelerate aging in a way we don't really like. So we pull back on that, and we do char 3 in Texas, but char 4 in Kentucky with our whiskeys. And this is another reason why what's really frustrating in Texas and waiting so long is you're losing your inventory constantly as well. So what was started out as a full barrel in Texas, we were losing like 8% a year for the first couple of years, and then it levels off. That's called the angel's share. That's the evaporation rate that is out of the barrel. And that's what we, joke around about, that the angels are drinking the whiskey. Oh, there's our bottling. So I forgot to mention, we bottle by hand. So everything is just done like this. It's literally a craft distillery in Blanco, Texas. So we bottle everything and label everything by hand so that you have that really nice. I feel like it gives an energy and a vibe to the whiskey. It goes out the door with a lot of love, because everybody that works with us is really into whiskey, like super into whiskey. I feel really lucky we found this team. So when we're tasting American whiskey, we're going to have a more robust experience. They tend to be darker. If you want to hold up your whiskey, have a look. They're burnt amber. Our port, you'll see that has a little bit of ruby in it. You're going to see it's a deeper color than if you had a older Scotch. Now they do color Scotches. They're allowed to do that. It's flavorless and odorless, but it's a little bit hard to always evaluate Scotch whiskeys. But if you were to see Scotch whiskeys not colored, they're light colored. This is barley-based spirit and used casks, and they're delicious. I wish they'd keep them uncolored, but they would be a lot lighter, more like a honey, or like a light honey color. Then we're going to smell our whiskey. Now, this is very different than what it is in wine. You're going to not stick your nose in it really far, because, as I said, these are at least by law 40% alcohol by volume. So you don't want to get all that ethanol and burn your receptors here. You're just trying to get the perfume off of it. And if you're new to whiskey, it's going to feel strong. And I just try to visualize going through the ethanol and try to get at the flavors there. Ethanol helps suspend flavor molecules really, really well. And another example of this is perfume. Perfume is high. It has a lot of alcohol in it because it suspends all those aromatics. So we're going to breathe in and just kind of get that experience. And then once we taste, we can get the smell back through that retronasal olfaction, is what they call it. And that's the smells going back up over out of your nose here. And then tasting whiskey. If it is your first time and you're not a big whiskey drinker, it will taste really strong to you. Is it a long finish? Is it a short finish? Meaning, like, how long does it last in the back of your throat? Is it thin? Is it syrupy? Is it viscous? And then finally, people are like, hey, I don't get how to describe whiskeys. How does this happen? How do you guys do it? Yes, it can get geeky here. But when you're first tasting whiskey, I like to think in big generalities. Does it taste sweet? What kind of sweet is it? Is it like a brown sugar sweet, or caramel, or butterscotch, or coconut? Like, you could start thinking about what kind of sweet it is. Fruity, apple, pear, lemon. Like, you start to think in generalities. Again, woodsy. People always say wood or smoker wood. Well, there's actually lots of different kinds of wood that you can get out of certain whiskeys. These are not particularly woody at all. But if you did, in Scotch whiskeys, you do get a lot of big, heavy smoke and peat or medicinal kind of flavors you get in certain Scottish and Irish whiskeys, actually. Let's start with a single barrel. And I think this is really a fun exercise, because single barrels in general tend to be the more rich and high proof, right? And this is rich, but you're going to notice that the triple cask, which actually has a lot of younger whiskeys in it, is going to it's higher proof, but it's going to taste less high proof. It's a trick we can do when we start blending and batching from our cask. So go ahead, start, as I said, take your whiskey, have a look at it, and have a sip. So smell it, have a sip, and think about that texture. Because a single barrel, what is a single barrel? It means that we took the whiskey out of one single barrel and we bottled it in 200 and about, well, I don't know what the barrel you're drinking yielded, anywhere from 250 to about 280 bottles. They are usually fetch a premium. They're usually more expensive. And the reason for that is just because, like, for a lot of reasons, you're just drinking out of one single barrel. It's a more specialty item. It doesn't necessarily mean it's better. It is a special item, though. And they're much harder to produce, because when you have single barrels, it's like your team has to literally like bottle one single barrel, bottle one single barrel, bottle one single barrel, as opposed to what we do in what the 99.9% of the whiskeys are what is called vatted. Okay, so that's what we'll get into next. So you want to nose it, you want to taste it. And then have the triple cask in your right hand. And go ahead and smell and notice that it's a little brighter on the smell. I think it's a little bit brighter. It's a little more fragrant. And then have a taste of that. And it's going to feel a little mellower, and it has a little more, I think, complexity, because now we're doing something called vatting. So if that was a single barrel, this is where I get to have fun. This is where it's like, what casks do I want to use to create this whiskey? And in this case, we are using that pot still, the 200 or 300 gallon pot still you saw earlier. So we're using that. We're using the 4-year-old you just tasted. So we're using the lot from that single barrel whiskey is in there, and very old whiskeys that are about right now. Actually, we're taking a bit of a hit because the inventory, actually, these whiskeys are now around 13, 14 years old, but we could still have this quite a bit of the same flavor at 10-year-old whiskey. So it's actually quite old vintage whiskey in there. And those 3 whiskeys come together to create triple cask whiskey. It is called a blend of straight bourbon whiskeys. It is not a blended whiskey. Technically, a blended whiskey is something very different, but the government couldn't figure out how to really effectively call what we were doing straight bourbon. They said, well, you're using different casks, so let's call it a blend of straight bourbon whiskeys. The consumer will totally understand that. Kind of. It just means you have to understand that straight means minimum of 2 years. And so if it says a blend of straight bourbon whiskeys, you know that we're using fully aged bourbon casks. It's bourbon, as opposed to a blended whiskey, which is you do not have to use any aged whiskey. You can make 80% of your bottle can be unaged. So the beauty of the triple cask, as you taste it, the idea is that we have, like Marlene calls it, like there's this pop of spice on the back. So if you want to sip it and hold it in your mouth for like 8 seconds, hold it in your mouth and then swallow. And that's where you get this like little pop of spice at the end. He's the kind of like the wily teenager, she calls it. I like that. That's that pot still. It's got a long finish and a nice structure, but that's coming from that aged whiskey. See, this is where I have so much fun. And then that mid palate vanilla silkiness is from that 4-year-old. 4-year-old is a really nice sweet spot for bourbon, especially if it comes from Tennessee, where that 4-year-old comes from, or Kentucky, which our future will also have in there for the triple cask. So it is not a single barrel. So we take our 3 casks and then we vat that. It's called a vatting. So we vat it and then we bottle it. So that is actually quite a complicated process. It's not that's not really that easy for the team out there, because they're constantly having the percentages, by the way, change. Because if you remember all the ways that a whiskey barrel can change character, it means that my recipe will often change too. It's just the one proprietary thing. If I say it's 50% this, and then I say that, and then like 3 months later, I do 50%, but the barrel's aged too strongly, I got to pull back and make that 30% and the other one. And then you get into conundrum because people are like, oh, I thought it was 30% of your own whiskey. And you're like, well, it's too strong. I had to pull back on that and use 4-year-old. And then you get in trouble for that. Or if someone thinks like, oh, I thought it was 80% old whiskey. And you're like, well, they got too old and evaporated and too thick. So I pull back on that. So I tweak those recipes, but I tell you where they're from. So we tweak those recipes pretty often, actually quite often. So those are the 3 casks in there. I love that whiskey, and I like to put it on ice. And another way I love to drink that is I take an orange peel and I just put a little orange essence in it, and it really brightens it. So the single barrel that you tasted is that rich. It has a silky, more of like, I think of like a uniform taste. It's really, I love it. It has much more of that sort of, it doesn't have as much like going in and out as you would in, say, a triple cask has been batched. But you do have that specialty item, which makes it really fun because once you drink a single barrel, it's gone forever. And that's just the magic of whiskey. Like that barrel will never, those bottles you have or that Wine Geeks has, like if you like it, that's it. Like the next, barrels always have their unique personality, even to next to each other can have slight variation, which is pretty fun. And then the last whiskey, this is really cool. We brought in port barrels from Portugal, and we were kind of experimenting with this whiskey, right? So we finish a lot of whiskeys. We have to do something.
This is the rye we're talking about.
Yeah, the port finished rye. Take your single barrel, or actually just take your triple cask and port finished rye and go back and forth. And if you're before this class, we're like, all whiskey kind of tastes the same, or have trouble differentiating. These two are where you will really notice. Just smell them and you're like, yep, there's a difference here. We're using rye. So in order to be called a bourbon in the United States, it must be made with 51% corn. And rye must be made with 51% rye. This is a high rye. It's 95% rye. It comes from Indiana, from MGP. So I actually broker with these guys. They are great rye makers. I've always liked their rye. I've written about them in the past before I came here. But we bring in different ages of the rye. And then it's like, well, we have to do something, make it kind of interesting or different. Like, what can we do? We were experimenting with this rye. And what we did was we brought in these port barrels from Portugal, and coming from Scotland, I thought it would age in like, I don't know, 8 months, maybe, or a year. Cause I knew it was like a year and a half to 2 to get really good flavor in Scotland. Cause we've got that temperate climate there. And then it was like 5 weeks, Marlene, that woman in that picture, she's like, we have to pull these out. I was like, what are you talking about? She goes, they already too porty. Like there's too much flavor in this. And there was like dark red, and it was just like sticky, like I was like, I was like, wow, that's so crazy. We got to pull that out. So there was the winery close by in a town called Fredericksburg, and they had an empty vat that they were selling. So we quickly got a pickup truck and we brought that to our distillery. We poured that port barrel in to stop the aging because we didn't want any more port flavor. And then I was like, let's mellow it out, So then we got another vat. We took the same barrel, put the rye again, kind of mellow, vatted that. Then the same one again, did that. We probably did that maybe 4 times. And then in that vatting tank, while it was like sitting there and mingling, that's when it became like just a really nice, beautiful sheen on that whiskey. We got it to a place where it still tasted like whiskey, but had an element of dark fruits, cherry, slight bit of tannin. Some people say toffee, dark brown sugar. It's really beautiful. I love that whiskey. Now it's a beast to make because now we have to do that. We have to do that all the time. Sometimes we can get away with if it's not a quick fresh barrel, it'll taste better like just 1 or 2 finish cycles. But it is quite, so how do we do it? We bring these different barrels in. And again, we're actually experimenting with a couple different ryes. We're going to bring in another Tennessee rye soon. And we're actually now currently experimenting with Wisconsin rye barrels, which are Wisconsin port barrels. So trying to see if that will work, because I like the idea of supporting an American port company. So it'd be kind of fun to see where that goes. But we bring that in. We're constantly kind of filling them in barrels and testing them and emptying them, filling them in barrels and testing them and emptying them. So that's how that port finished rye is made. And what's happened is it aged so quickly because it's so hot here, but then it's cold, and then it's hot, and then it's cold. And for anyone who lives in a house with wooden doors that like sometimes they close and sometimes they don't, your wood is expanding and your wood is contracting. And so literally the Texan weather was like acting like an accordion on that barrel. And like, okay, all the whiskey was going in and grabbing flavor, and it was all coming out and resting. It was going in and resting. It's like a lot. I think we don't know why. I mean, people have not been making port finished rye in Texas ever. So it's not like we're the first. So we just think that's what happened, is that it's just like all sorts of chemistry and heat is playing and terroir is playing to create that really unusual, beautiful whiskey. And what it did also for me, was really exciting, was it really mellowed it really mellowed that rye out. A lot of people think rye is really peppery and difficult, and I don't get that. This is like a really beautiful, elegant. It almost has, for me, a little bit of an influence of Scotland. Like it's a little drier. It's not like a big, sweet, peppery rye. It's like kind of a more of an elegant finesse to it. I hope so. I hope you guys taste that. So, and that's pretty much it for our whiskeys. We're Milam Greene again. Heather Green and Marsha Milam is my partner. She's an entrepreneur here in Austin. She brought me down as a consultant and I ended up staying. She did the same thing with Marlene. So be careful if you ever meet her and come to Texas, you're going to stay. She's very compelling. And so Marlene, we're really delighted to have her. We also have a really great brewer and masher. So his name is Jordan Osborne. And we're just really delighted that you guys, we're really thankful that Wine Geeks brought us to New York to introduce us to New York. We're really excited. The whiskey you're drinking is award-winning. We have a lot of press, really great press on this whiskey. People seem to really like it. It was, even wine enthusiasts said it was one of the top 10 bourbons, the triple cast last year. They didn't have the single barrel or the port finish rye, so maybe we'll get that this year for them. Any questions or about any whiskey in general?
I just want to, I think that, the port finish rye is like such a great example of what finishing whiskeys can be, and and how dramatic sometimes the effect can be. Because totally, like, I find the bourbon to be spicier than the rye, because those port barrels just totally mellowed it out. It's really interesting.
Oh, you found that? Well, yeah, that's interesting because also the triple cast especially has that our pot still whiskey. It's like really spicy, and I actually like it. I actually started tweaking it just a little bit more try to push as much of our own pot distilled whiskey from Texas in there as possible every couple releases. You can't just completely change a whiskey. I mean, if you're a craft whiskey, you have a little bit of, you can do that. If you're a Jack Daniels, you can't. It's just like Jack Daniels has to always be Jack Daniels. But I try to push just a little bit of that because I like that spiciness, until I'm told that I went overboard.
We have a question from Mark Garbin.
Hi, Ruby Port. It's Ruby Port right now. Yep. Oh, the age. I don't know the age of the actual port that was in it. We work with different brokers in Portugal, and they work with their Portuguese port makers, and they bring those in and then they sell them to us. We don't know where. I might have a record of which places they come from in Portland, Portugal. The thing with bringing in for finishing, whether it's a sherry barrel, a rum, a wine, or port, is you don't really want the nuance of the port in there. What you're just getting is the flavors that it's kind of left behind, and it's like seasoned pot. So we're kind of getting, whether it's rum, same thing. Like rum offers it's like the sugars, the type of sugars that they leave behind and how they season that barrel, not necessarily the actual port that was in it or the age. You wouldn't know that, but I can look into it.
How do they maintain the integrity of the barrel when they transport it across the Atlantic?
That is a really good question. This is why, another reason why I'm experimenting with Wisconsin, because that can be abysmal. Like sometimes we'll get, our brokers will say things like, this is needs work, in which case we would have a cooper kind of refinish them. Some staves can break down. Usually they transport with some port still slopping around in them. And you will get, as a whiskey person, like I'll get an email from them saying, hey, I just got a lot of really good port barrels in. Or, Marlene will be like, these were terrible. We got one in and we experimented with, for example, it just didn't, I liked it. It just didn't give the same flavor. So we did a distillery only, but that is managing the supply chain is one of the most difficult things, because there is, especially during the past year with COVID, there's been tremendous pressure on the shipping channels and supply chain on every level, even our bottles, which come from France. You know, we're a craft distillery, and now they're like, you have to buy like 5,000 at a time. And like, they're just sitting, we had to get like truck containers to keep them in.
Do you sell your barrels once you use them?
You know, we do. We don't sell them to Europe. Mostly people just come by and they want to buy a barrel and we sell it. But we do a lot of partnerships. So there's, we actually, a lot of beer makers here, craft beer makers come by and they'll just say, hey, because we just always have barrels, you know, so they'll just come by, they'll pick up some barrels and finish their beer in them. So there's actually Three Nations Brewing and 33 Union Bear Brewing in Texas have our barrels, and I think some are going to Chicago for a brewery up there. But
Brian, I see your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
I did, and I apologize if this is repeated information. I'm still working in the background and listening with the other ear. Did you say what the mash bill was on these?
I didn't.
Okay, because I am very curious.
That's fine. So the rye is a high rye. We are using, it's 95% rye. So that's a super high rye. For our other two whiskeys, we have the same. So they're going to be 58% corn, 30, oh my God, now I'm going to do the math, 8% barley and the rest rye.
My only other foray in the Texas whiskey so far has been what I assume most people's first foray into Texas is, which is Garrison Brothers.
Right.
And Garrison Brothers has, at least from the couple that I've had, a very high corn mash that is very apparent. So I wasn't quite sure what I was going to get into with these, and honestly, I was very pleasantly surprised, honest. So I was curious what the difference was.
Well, Garrison has a lot of differences than us. So there will be a mash bill, but also they age 100% on site in Texas. Remember, I said I like Garrison Brothers and I'm friends with them. So I'm not trying to. They're not far. They're about 20 minutes from us, and I've always known Dan Garrison. He's a good guy. That wasn't my palate. That kind of really high corn, accelerate, really fast aged whiskey from Texas. We do have that in our pot still. We create ones that are like that feel, but as a whiskey drinker and Marlene, that's why we also make whiskeys in other states, and we make it here. We blend and batch, and then we have that for consumers who want all those different experiences within our portfolio. But Garrison, they have a different mash, so that's going to be different stills that they use. They also do for a long time, I don't know if they've switched it back, they do very tiny barrels. Like they're like literally like that big, like 10, 15, 20 gallon barrels. Again, as I said earlier, everybody was trying to find early on ways to accelerate aging. And I think what we found and what he's found is that's not really something people ended up loving. And it's just, at the end of the day, it's got to be those 53 gallons, maybe 30 in Texas. And you got to wait. You just got to wait until that happens. So their barrels are a little bit different. Their distillation's different and their mash is different. And they don't blend from different distilleries. So they're just a difference. Like I said, the architecture is the same. And then within that, you can make some choices.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Like I said, I just, that was the only other Texas I'd had. So I didn't know whether that was a Texas style to have a higher corn. So it was cool going into this and because this is the only other Texas I've had. So you guys are officially the first Texas that I have fully enjoyed. So.
Well, that's good news for me. Thank you.
It's good news for wine geeks too, honestly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you. We love this whiskey. I'm really proud of it and our team. I'm really happy with it. It was a tough sell, right? When I first came on, tough sell, trying to convince everybody, like, we don't have to do everything that's not part of bourbon history is to do everything right here on site. But, that's a tough way to go because you do in Texas, And unless you're in Kentucky or Tennessee, you're playing with fire, literally playing with fire, because it may or may not taste good. And, and that's a big experiment. And I really like a nice traditional whiskey, and I like to play with that flavor and nuance, but I don't want to bust it out where it's like too hard to drink. I think the single barrel, I tasted Garrison recently. I thought it was really lovely. It was a single barrel aged like 6 years. It was pretty good, actually. It was really good.
Do you think that the fact that you started with Scotch in Scotland affects some of your decisions in that way?
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Not only working in Scotland, but the book and spending time in Japan. I love Japanese. I ended up falling in love with a lot of Japanese whiskeys. And when I went there, like to Yamazaki, and I could see they have on their site, they don't have like lots of distilleries, right? So they're on their site, they have a pot still and they have a column still, and they have like different stills that they tweak depending on the flavor. And then they have all these different casks, and then they have warehouses up and down Japan. And so guess what? People freaking love Japanese whiskey because they can, tweak all the flavor they want. And it's really about because they're saying, like, it's thinking about the consumer in mind first, and then backing that up and saying, how do I get there to make something? Like for us, it was how do we make a really drinkable, wonderful whiskey that can sit on a shelf at Wine Geeks and compete with Kentucky whiskey, but still have a moat around it that gives it a uniqueness of Texas. And that was because we knew that would sell, like that people sell, meaning like not in a cynical way, that people would want to drink it and buy it and put it on their shelves, and I feel like in a lot of ways the Japanese kind of really approached it that way too. Like, what are we going to do to make a really beautiful whiskey? At first they studied from Scotland and they were like, how do we emulate? We want to make a Scotch. We want to emulate Scotch. And then they backtracked and they really kind of figured out how to do that. And I just really like that. And then the Scottish thing, where I got a lot of Scottish influence was, they have had a long tradition of trading casks, having somebody like me, a warehouse manager or a master blender, buying and bringing casks in. So Johnny Walker is a great example. All of their whiskeys were at one time, was John Glazer, who runs Compass Box now, was a sommelier, and he was at Johnny Walker and find different casks to blend in batch. That's its own style. And then at places like Glenfiddich and Balvenie, they had, 200 years worth of whiskey, and they'd pluck different barrels and casks. So they didn't have, legally, they can't trade if you're a single malt Scotch or bring anything in, but I have offshoots that do. Kinenvy is, for example, William Grant, who makes Balvenie and Glenfiddich, they're blended and they batching arms. So, and then there's companies in Scotland that I really love. They're called independent bottlers. That's what the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society was. We didn't make whiskey, but we brokered and we found things and we thought they were beautiful. And Signatory, Gordon MacPhail, I'm trying to think of the other Scotch Malt Whiskey Society, who you guys probably know. There's a bunch of the Compass Box. They're all doing that. And so I brought that. I didn't bring that to America, but distilleries were hiding that they were doing that, and they got into big trouble. And I just was one of the first to celebrate it. And, I came into Texas, they're like, are you making everything? You have to make it like us. Like, that's how you're going to be certified. I'm like, I'm not going to make it like that. Like, that's not what I want to make. And then at first they were a little bit in Texas, they were a little like, not, the whiskey industry was like, what are those two doing? Those two clowns, me and Marlene and the rest of them. And then I would just come straight out like, yeah, this is how we're making it. And this is how we do it. And it is influenced by Scotland and Japan. And they finally were like, the tools that they thought they'd use kind of against us at first, I was saying, no, those are what gives us an advantage, because that's what they do in other countries to make great whiskey. And now I think it works. So in fact, New York Times just did a big piece on blended people doing what we're doing. I'm not sure why I wasn't in there, but that's another story.
Wow.
Because he's my friend. I was like, hey, what happened?
Do we have any other questions for Heather or any comments about the whiskeys before we wrap up?
Well, it
What was
means,
what was everyone's favorites?
oh yeah.
John, which one did you like the best? You taste a lot of whiskey.
Actually, I enjoyed all of them, but the single barrel was very good. Though I did like the triple, and it depends on my mood of what I would like to drink, and what the taste would be. And I'm not a rye drinker, but I enjoy the rye.
Thanks, John.
I
Yeah.
think there's a difference between drinking whiskey straight and drinking whiskey in a cocktail. And if I were to drink it straight, my favorite by far is the rye, even though like my fellow imbiber, I'm not that much of a rye aficionado, but the port finish actually creates that je ne sais quoi about it, which is really unusual. And it's a nice sipper. And I've got an ice cube in your Milam Greene glass over here
Nice.
that I'm going
Oh,
to.
you got the good glasses. I love those.
And from a just personal preference, I'm not a big high rye bourbon drinker. In fact, I actually quite like the lower rye and some of the wheated. But I found that the triple cask has a very unique flavor to it. And I can't wait to make an old fashioned out of it.
I should mention there's something else we do that's in the triple cast. We actually malt our rye, which is really unusual. We have it malted before it gets to us. And that adds a toastiness to the triple cask as well.
So who's got the monkey shoulder by moving the rye around?
I have monkey shoulder from trying to create a garden in Texas, and I didn't know how hard shoveling was. After coming from New York, I have monkey shoulder.
Yeah, right. And so
Yeah.
I'm actually going to create an old fashioned out of the triple cask and see how it is. The single barrel I found very particularly forceful, which is unusual for only a 96 proof. You'd expect something. It punches above its weight. This is almost a cask strength in the way it kind of feels to me. So I'm looking forward to creating a Manhattan light on the vermouth, but a little bit of Luxardo cherry juice in it with the Luxardo cherry on the rocks, and I'll let you know how it is.
Yeah, please let me know. That sounds delicious.
And what time should we be over?
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I always say, like, if you're gonna, these are boozy forward, old fashions and Manhattans and Sazeracs, it does matter the whiskey and when you're making these
Right.
these kinds of drinks as you're making. If you're gonna have a whiskey punch or a sour, or like a million ingredients, you're gonna shake it in and put it in a martini glass. Like, to me, that's where you can kind of get away with something, because I think at that time you've lost the nuance of the whiskey. But
Exactly. That's why you want whiskey forward in the cocktails that I'm thinking of, because that puts the whiskey in sharp relief and creates a balance in the cocktail, which is, I'm just thinking it's going to be delicious. I'm sorry you guys won't be able to come over.
I know, me too.
that's not, wait, so what are you gonna do with, you're gonna do a Luxardo sherry and what else?
I'm going to be I'm going to be different on the vermouth. I'm going to use the Dolan on the triple cask because it's a little bit more herbal. I'm going to use the Carpano on the single barrel because it's a little bit of sweeter. We'll be offsetting some of that forcefulness. And then in the single barrel, I'll use for the Manhattan, a little bit of a Luxardo cherry juice and a Luxardo cherry. With the old fashioned, I'm going to have an orange, and I'm going to use an orange bitter and then probably a slice of orange in it.
Wow.
Mark, where do
I
you
know
live?
his cocktails.
Where exactly do you live?
I live in Bronxville.
Oh, it's not far.
It's on our way home.
I know.
That's good.
I'm excited about that. Do let us know what
I sure will.
what you enjoyed. And in fact, maybe we do a newsletter, Milam Greene Whiskey newsletter. So if you go to our website, you can join it. I might find out what you do, send it to our mixologist who does the cocktails and recipes and put it on our newsletter. I think it'd be really fun.
Perfect.
I think it'd be really cool. Couple weeks or something.
And then we're all coming over, right?
Be fabulous. Yeah. Wow, that's really cool.
Well, I'm going to throw my 2 cents in. I loved all three, of course, and you know, and to make a musical reference, I thought like the single barrel was like a terrific, you know, singer-songwriter at a piano doing this beautiful song, and then with the triple cask, you add in a bass player and a drummer underneath, and a little, you know, and then the port finish on the rye I thought was fantastic. I'm normally a rye guy. If I got to choose between rye and bourbon, I'll
And
probably
so
go
who's
rye.
the music on the port cask? Eddie Van Halen?
That was not the music analogy left me for that one. It's like, but
Okay,
but I of all three, I find myself going back to the bourbon, the triple cask, again and
That's the
again.
one that really
And
spoke to me as more of a
and I think
novice
your
whiskey
blending
drinker.
skills really come in there because it's got like this tremendous texture to it and a lot of different notes happening in that. But all three of them are fabulous.
I love the brightness
I
of the
like
triple
them all.
cask.
Huh?
I love the brightness of the triple cask. That really appeals. to me.
brighter.
It's so approachable.
It's bright. It's definitely brighter, I think, too. That came about. We actually there was a bunch of us, and we had all sorts of different concoctions and incarnations of that triple cask, and it was all done blind. And I guided everybody through. That was down here in Marlene. It was her first like blending exercise coming from BAME. It was pretty fun, and then we blind proofed. I really believe in blind proofing. So that's, adding water, and that's what we landed on. It was coincidentally was the same for the port finished rye. We did blind proofing on that too. That wasn't something we chose that they're the exact same proof. They were literally done at different times and different proofs and different same panel. And we all chose the same proof. So yeah. It's not, I mean, I like blending I'll start it, but I like blending by committee, like making sure that the panel agrees with it. Cause I do think that a panel is a better way to get at a really good whiskey than just like one person. Cause that one person may have what they call an anosmia, which is the blind spot in smell or taste that they may not know they have. And I can think of a few whiskey makers that like have that to me. Maybe and I want to make sure that there's not something there that's off to somebody. You always want to try to catch that.
That's called osmia?
Anosmia. In fact, you probably read about it. ANOSMIA. In fact, people are talking about it a lot because COVID is giving people that, which is the lack of smell and taste. And
Right.
all of us have blind spots in nosing and tasting. That's just scientifically. So when I was writing my book, we were at the Monell Chemical Senses Institute down in Philadelphia. Now, chemical meaning everything is a chemical, not like chemicals as in Windex. But they're the head researchers on olfaction and tasting. And that's where I learned a lot of the stuff about nosing and tasting from the scientists there. We did a few experiments, and for example, if you block your nose and taste all the whiskeys, you wouldn't notice any difference amongst them, even if you had a smoky peated whiskey. Despite what people want you to believe, you wouldn't. You have to have the nose part. But what it is out of a 350 genes, for example, 450 genes, that determine our ability to taste, for example, have our receptors. Almost a third will vary amongst us. So some of us have very, very sensitive receptors to bitter. That's why some people hate cilantro, or, and some people can really take dark, strong coffee and chocolate and cilantro. That's biological more. But then there's also the cultural aspects too. So that's why I like to do it by panel, because you want to make sure that you're kind of making sure that my blind spots aren't getting into that whiskey in a way that I don't want it to be.
Yeah, same thing applies to a somm tasting wine. The sooner you can figure out what your blind spots are, and the better you'll be at your job.
Yeah.
And that was the first thing I was told too, as a somm, was it's not about you, right? It's easy to buy things that you like, taste things you like, but you're tasting for everyone and everybody's palate.
Yeah. Wow, that's a good point. It's true.
I'm sitting here wondering if I can get a vaccine for anosmia.
Well, I don't know about you, but that's one thing about COVID that terrifies me is, losing my sense of smell.
Yeah.
You're done, you can't do your job anymore.
That's how I felt too. I was like, I was like a hermit, because same thing. Like, I was like, yeah, I can get sick and get better, but I can't lose my sense of smell. That would really stink. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Pun intended. Yeah.
On that note, it's 20 after, so we're going to have to wrap this up now. Does anybody have any last questions or comments? All
Great,
right.
thank you.
Well, I just want to make sure that everyone knows we're offering any participants in the class a 10% discount on any of these 3 whiskeys for the full week. The discount will end next Sunday. So if at any time during this week you want to call in, remind us that you were here at the class, and we'll give you a 10% discount. We don't usually discount spirits, but in this case,
That's how much we love Heather.
Aw. I'm excited. I can't wait to come. I'll be up this summer to see you guys. We'll do something in person. Oh,
We're all
who's
going
that?
to,
Wait, where is it? Mark? Is it Mark that makes cocktails?
we're going to Mark's
yes.
house.
Okay, so no, Mark is gonna come to, we're gonna sit in your parking lot and have Mark's cocktails.
Sounds good.
What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, deck chair.
Works for me.
We'll put out a deck chair. I mean, maybe you guys, who knows? Let's see what's going on, but we're gonna pop by and sit in deck chairs.
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't do that. We're gonna have to do it in the woods somewhere.
Oh. Okay, we'll do it in the woods. Even
There's
more.
laws about that, drinking in the parking lot.